Chapter 19, A Nation Divided. Now this will be a little longer than some of the other videos, mostly because there's just so much material in here, and this is a really fascinating topic, both from a historical point of view and from an economic point of view. So we're going to talk about what are the factors that led up to the Civil War. So there's three major factors. The first are economic changes. The second is westward expansion, and the third is fracturing of the political parties. When we talk about the economic changes, what we really are talking about is that the North and South were fundamentally different economies. The South was very agrarian based, the North was very focused on manufacturing, and there was not a whole lot of overlap from there. And so these changes led to a large disparity of wealth. While there were several very rich Southern farmers and plantation owners, the majority of those living in the South were not very rich, while the North and the growth of the large cities and manufacturing led to immense wealth and larger increases in GDP. When we talk about the westward expansion, we're talking about what happened with some of these presidents. We ended previous chapters with Andrew Jackson. Martin Van Buren followed him. The Panic of 1837 didn't do him very well, and so William Henry Harrison was elected as a Whig. Remember, Andrew Jackson started the Democratic Party, so the Whigs now set up, and the Whigs proposed to carry on this American system as proposed by John Quincy Adams. Unfortunately, William Henry Harrison died, and in his place came President John Tyler. So John Tyler focused and really pushed this notion of manifest destiny, that it was the divine, the providence, the future and destiny of the United States to go from sea to shining sea. So they pushed it west. The movie, which is one of the highest grossing movies of all time, Gone with the Wind, focuses on this. And the famous line from this, land is the only thing worth working for, worth fighting for, worth dying for. And so John Tyler, as a Whig, pushes this to expansion. And so he establishes the manifest destiny. He gets rid of the National Bank. He vetoes it actually twice. But he sought to annex Texas as a state. The problem is, if you annex just Texas, it now brings an imbalance of the number of free states and slave states in the Senate. And that was a major issue. This is an issue that he fought over with the Whig Party. And so as a result, while president, he actually leaves the Whig Party. And that leads us to the election of 1844. And James K. Polk is then elected as the president, and he has four main goals: reestablish the independent treasury, to reduce the tariffs, acquire the Oregon Territory, and acquire California. By doing this, he can then balance out the Senate, especially with California. And what does James K. Polk do? Well, it turns out there's a song by the Bare Naked Ladies that talks just about this. Let's listen.
In 4 short years he met his every goal. He seized the whole Southwest from Mexico, made sure the tariffs fell, and made the English sell the Oregon Territory. He built an independent treasury.
And I'll let you listen to the rest of it later. But James K. Polk meets all of his goals and does not run for re-election. And so now we have this issue of, again, of westward expansion. So the Compromise of 1820 established this red line across the southern point of Missouri, saying no future expansion of states north of this line will be allowed slavery. South of it, they can. And so we get then the Compromise of 1850, where Texas is added as a slave state. And in return, we add other states. So we get Texas, Arkansas added as states. California and Iowa are added as free states. And so we have now an equal balance of slave states and free states. And then the Utah and New Mexico territory are open to slavery through popular sovereignty. So they could choose for themselves. Now this is creeping up because now there's this Missouri Compromise line. This was not U.S. territory at the time. And the question is, should they be allowed, or is that a violation of the Missouri Compromise? Well, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 really solidifies this challenge of westward expansion. Kansas and Nebraska had very fertile land. And so as a result, they wanted to be able to have state sovereignty, the state right to choose whether they're free or not. The problem is that violated the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise. And so that led to some major challenges and major issues, and really led to the forefront of representation in the Senate of how many slave states and how many free states. At the same time, as we get to the elections, we have the rise of Lincoln. So the rise of the Republican Party. Joining off the Whig Party and the Democratic Party, now this third party comes along, the Republican Party. And their stance on slavery was very important because the Whigs were abolitionists, the Democrats were pro-slavery. Is the Republican Party took the stance that the federal government should not interfere with states' rights. And so states should be able to choose whether they could be slave states or free states. They also supported the Fugitive Slave Act, which is as slaves escaped from slavery in the South and went north, it was the responsibility of the North to arrest them and return them. But they were also, so this established the existing states, but they were also very much in favor of abolition in new territories. So any of these new territories, if they were to be added as states, they would be added as free states. And they were also focused on maintaining the Union. The Union was very fragile at this time. And so in the 1860 election, Abraham Lincoln wins, and what's a fascinating book I encourage all to read is called Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin, and she writes that when Lincoln wins the Republican nomination, he then establishes and appoints his rivals to key cabinet positions, and that's really, I think, in my opinion, one of the great reasons why he was such a great president, is he had his rivals there working with him. But when Lincoln wins the presidency, it's now clear, and the future is, especially with the Republican Party stance, that when states are added, they'll be added as free states. That's going to make the South lose their ability to maintain slavery. And so before the inauguration, after the election, South Carolina is the first state to address this issue, and they officially secede from the Union. This is not the first time they tried this, didn't defy the federal government. Remember back with Andrew Jackson? But now they go and they secede in 1860. They're arguing for states' rights. They complained that the northern states weren't upholding the federal law of the Fugitive Slave Act. Then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Virginia, and Texas follow them. And they form the Confederate States of America. And so we talk about oftentimes the cause of the Civil War. And many are going to argue states' rights versus federal rights. But there is one issue at hand. And there's only one issue that they care about states' rights. And that is the issue of slavery. The southern states wanted to maintain their right to maintain the institution of slavery. And the reason why this was so important is because their economy was based on the use of slavery. Their agrarian production, which was, again, King Cotton, all throughout Europe, all throughout America, relied on free labor. And if you were to liberate those slaves, it would dramatically impact those that had their wealth built into the slaves. And so it was very much a big part of their economy. And so you might argue, well, what it was really the cause? Was it really slavery? So this is Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederate States of America. I will let you read this, but just to highlight what he said, our opposition is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, he said, African slavery, this was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. They identified the issue of slavery. So states' rights is part of it, but the states' rights they wanted more than anything was the right of the state to legalize slavery. And that became the major issue, is should states have that right? And it was an economic argument by the South that they really wanted to maintain their economy based on slavery and their production specifically of cotton and other cash crops. And so we see this Jeffersonian view that dominates the South. And so it's very much in this way. And so it's this idea of internal improvements intended to facilitate commerce. And they wanted to say that this is not the role of the federal government, that the role of the federal government is to allow the states to push forward on their abilities to focus on production of cotton and international trade. Even you have Louis T. Wigfall, senator from Texas, and James Henry Hammond, senator from South Carolina, again, talking about this notion that cotton is king, that their hope in going to war by declaring this is that they would get Europe, not just England, but France and other countries in Europe on their side as their allies, because they would stop selling cotton to them if they didn't choose to support them. And that was their hope. It didn't work. And so we talk about the North. The North just had more people, 19 million people. They had a conscription act where they would actually then draft people, and they allowed other people to find replacements. But they just had more resources to draw more people. It turns out the immigrants that were there were not in favor of this war, and there was many riots that happened during the Civil War. And the immigrants didn't want to join the war because if you were to free slavery, that would increase the labor supply, and that would actually impact their job opportunities. And so a lot of these new immigrants were not in favor of fighting the South in the Civil War. The South had 9 million people, but a third of them were slaves. They also had laws where they provided exemptions. So for a family, for every 20 slaves you owned, you were given an exemption. And so this meant that the planter elites were not actually fighting the Civil War. Those that had the most to lose, those that had the greatest wealth, were not actually fighting. As we look at the resources to fight the war, the North just had much more innovation and much more ability to produce to win this war. That's what we learned in World War II. The U.S.'s ability to produce tanks and planes and ships outproduced any other country in the world. And that's what led to World War II. And that's what the North had. So they could produce 10 times as much as the South. They were based on manufacturing. The South hoped to rely on Europe, but that didn't happen. In the London Times, it quote says, "We are busy, as rich and as fortunate, and our trade in the American war had never broken out, and our trade with the States had never been disturbed. Cotton was no king." The use of cotton to try to gain European allies failed for the South. So here's just a brief timeline of the Civil War. So April 12th, 1861, Confederates attack Union soldiers at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. It begins. So we see these different battles. January 1st, 1863 comes the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free slaves. What it did was it designated that any rebellious state, any of those Confederate states, slaves in those states were forever free. And so there was still slavery in the North after the Emancipation Proclamation. But this said that any of those states in the South were now free, giving them the ability to come to the North, and the North then being able to say, we honored the Fugitive Slave Act because it was no longer in effect. And so that's what the Emancipation Proclamation does. It continues. We see in July 1863, draft riots in New York City, immigrants not wanting to be drafted and fight for this war. In 1863, Lincoln delivers the Gettysburg Address. Now, the South won these battles at the start of the war, but it was clear the North was going to win this war. Just their ability was much greater to fight this war. In 1864, Lincoln is reelected. General Sherman and the Union Army begins to push in the South and have great success in the South. And Lincoln thought, this is the time that we have to free all slaves. And so the 13th Amendment is passed in 1865, and this is what allows neither slavery nor involuntary servitude exist within the United States. But there is a caveat here, and we'll get to this in later chapters, that if you're punished for a crime, you can be enslaved. And that's going to be important a little bit later in the Reconstruction era. But now every black man, every black woman and child is free in the United States. So that we begin to see this great success in the South. April 14th, 1865, Lincoln is assassinated. And then May 26th, 1865, the Confederate Army surrenders, and we come to the end of the war. At the end of the war, we see this major turning point now. So with Lincoln out of the way, with Lincoln dead and the Republican Party now in control, we see the full adoption of the American system. Again, this is what John Quincy Adams pushed for years before. And it's this notion, a very Hamiltonian notion, that the government's role is to provide internal improvements, infrastructure, that it's to provide and support public education. Tariffs are a way to promote American economies, and they're in favor of tariffs, and they're in favor of a national banking system. And so just to show, you look at this slide and some of the things in the book that talked about Lincoln oversaw more land grants to railroads than any other president. That is, the government would grant the land to the railroad company who would then build those railroads and finance those railroads. Public education, the Morrill Land Grant Act designated land in every state to build colleges. Utah State is the Agricultural College of Utah, and that is made possible by the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862. Did you know, Andy Bernard, Cornell? Cornell is both a public and private university. Part of Cornell was founded based on that land grant, and then part of it is a private university. So it's both public and private. Now you knew. Tariffs, again, pushing for that protectionist thing, using tariffs to promote the American economy. And that was very big. In fact, that protectionist policy expands all the way until almost the Cold War is when the United States begins to change from this protectionist tariff policy to more of a free trade policy. And since then, the U.S. has always been a free trade policy until just recently. And that's a major issue that happens in current politics. What should the U.S. do specifically with China? The National Bank. So this time period from 1837 to 1863 is this free banking era. And in 1863, we established now these national banking acts all the way up to 1913 for the Federal Reserve. And we'll talk about the Federal Reserve later. But this free banking era is really challenging because there's really no unified currency. And it's a challenge within the United States. And the money supply and price levels were very unstable. You'd see a lot of inflation and then a lot of deflation Prices changing all over the place. Sometimes there's money to be had, sometimes you can't actually find money to use to buy things. And there were a lot of bank runs and a lot of bank failures at this time period. And so the national banking acts were designed in a very Hamiltonian type way to create a system of national banks, to create a national uniform currency, and then to create what they call secondary market for treasury securities. Bond markets allow for markets to buy and sell bonds, and that is a way to invest and to build the financial backbone of the United States. So the national banking acts were incredibly important. And this really serves as this turning point in our nation. Prior to this nation, it was really dominated by the Jeffersonian vision of the agrarian society, that the political leaders that were elected from the South and represented that Southern agrarian view of a laissez-faire form of government. With Lincoln's election, we see the establishment of the American system. Started with John Quincy Adams, and now Lincoln establishes it, and it changes the outlook and changes the direction and even the philosophy of the role of the federal government. And that the federal government's role is to create a system, create environment where businesses can thrive. Not to run those businesses like you would find in communism, but to create those environments so businesses can thrive. The railroad system is a great example of this, that the government gives land to the railroad companies for them to be able to build the railroads and to build that infrastructure throughout our nation. And so that's a big turning point we get with Lincoln's presidency, and the death of Lincoln and the Republican Party is this turning point in our